What happens when revolution turns its fury not just on kings but on the women caught in its path? In the chaos of the French Revolution, the streets of Paris became more than just a stage for justice. They became a stage for humiliation. Public shaming was wielded as a political weapon, particularly against women perceived as loyal to the ancien, or resistant to the fervor of revolutionary change. What began as a cry for bread and justice often devolved into ritualized displays of vengeance. During the March on Versailles in October 1789, thousands of women stormed the royal palace demanding food and reform. Though they were hailed as heroines of the revolution, that same revolutionary tide would later turn against other women, especially those of noble birth. Female courtiers and aristocratic women suspected of royalist ties were dragged before hostile crowds, often jeered at, and insulted their dignity, stripped as publicly as their titles. In the grim procession to the guillotine, women such as Madame Roland, a prominent Girondin intellectual, were transported in open tumbrils carts designed to maximize public exposure. As they passed through Paris, sans-culotte spectators mocked them, hurling insults and epithets. This was not simply transportation, it was a spectacle of degradation. A final ritual before death meant to erase any remnants of aristocratic pride. Punishment extended beyond execution. Women denounced as counter-revolutionary were often subjected to symbolic acts of humiliation, head shaving, enforced undressing to their shifts, and being paraded as cautionary examples. These actions, conducted in broad daylight, reflected the revolution as darker inclination towards street-level justice, where moral retribution blurred with public cruelty. As the revolution radicalized, it was litigious tyrants who were targeted. But anyone, especially any woman, who stood on the wrong side of public opinion, the streets of Paris were not just filled with revolutionary fervor, but with the voices of those who believed in the purity of the new order. They believed that those who supported the old regime needed to be punished. But it was often the women who became the targets of the most intense scrutiny. The very fabric of society was shifting, and the women who had once enjoyed the privileges of nobility were now seen as symbols of everything that needed to be torn down. In a way, their treatment was symbolic of the revolution itself, a force that did not hesitate. 2. Destroy the old world and humiliate anyone associated with it. The violence of the streets was a direct reflection of the violence within the hearts of the revolutionaries. They no longer saw women as individuals, but as representations of the monarchy, the church, and the old ways. During the months leading up to the most brutal phases of the revolution, women became the embodiment of everything the revolution was meant to dismantle. The same fervor that gave rise to the revolution also gave birth to a dark desire for vengeance against the very symbols of aristocracy and hierarchy. Women of noble birth were not just removed from their places of power and privilege, they were often humiliated and made to suffer in ways that were designed to break their spirit and erase their identity. Some were even forced to walk through the streets in their shifts, their hair shaved off as a means of stripping away their last traces of dignity. Their presence in the public eye was not meant to show justice, it was meant to show cruelty. As they walked through the streets, the crowds would jeer at them, hurling insults that were intended to degrade them not just as women but as human beings. The revolution had stripped them of everything: their titles, their wealth, and most importantly, their dignity. In this grim procession, the condemned women became an example of the true cost of revolution. They were not just marked for death, they were made to suffer in front of the public eye, so that others might learn from their humiliation. Their death was not enough to satisfy the revolutionary crowd. They needed to be made to feel small, to be stripped of their former glory before their inevitable end. The spectacle of their suffering was a form of entertainment for the masses, as much as it was an act of political vengeance. The revolution had turned its gaze upon them, and now they would be the ones to pay the price for the sins of the past. If the streets offered humiliation, the prisons of revolutionary France delivered silent suffering behind iron bars and stone walls. Thousands of women, noble and common alike, endured a daily descent into neglect, fear, and uncertainty. At the heart of Paris stood the conciergerie, ominously referred to as the antechamber to the guillotine, once a royal palace. It had become a transit point for the condemned female prisoners. Here were crammed into overcrowded, poorly ventilated cells where straw beds served as their only comfort. Illness spread quickly, and basic sanitation was nearly non-existent. Yet it was not disease alone that weighed on them. It was the suffocating silence of not knowing if the next sunrise would be their last. Other notorious prisons like La Force and Saint-Pie held large numbers of women, many accused under the sweeping law of suspects, enacted in 1793. With this decree, revolutionary authorities broadened the definition of enemy, resulting in mass arrests, women with aristocratic titles. Vague connections to emigrants, or even insufficient revolutionary zeal, were suddenly deemed dangerous. The system was overwhelmed, and living conditions deteriorated further as cells, meant for 6, might hold triple that number. We catch glimpses of this grim reality through the writings of Grace Dalrymple Elliot, a Scottish noblewoman imprisoned during the Reign of Terror. In her memoirs, she described the stench, the fear, and the constant roll call, each name read aloud, with a chill of dread, as it could signal execution. While male prisoners often shared political camaraderie, many imprisoned women were isolated from allies and family. The air was thick with despair, and the silence of the prison weighed heavily on the women behind bars. It was unteached the physical conditions that were unbearable. It was the lack of hope, the overwhelming uncertainty of not knowing whether each day would be their last. They lived in constant fear, their lives no longer their own, but in the hands of the revolutionaries, who could take it away with a single order. Each day they were reminded that no one was safe, not even the women who had once walked the halls of Versailles or graced the royal courts. Their dignity stripped, their identity erased, they were left to rot in the dark corners of history, while the revolution continued its bloody march. Women who had once been the wives of aristocrats, mothers of noble children, were now nothing more than prisoners to be judged, not by their actions, but by their class and their connection to the old regime. The very fact that they had once been a part of the royal court was enough to condemn them in the eyes of the revolutionaries. Many of the women who found themselves imprisoned during the Reign of Terror were accused under the law of suspects. The law gave authorities the power to arrest anyone suspected of being an enemy of the revolution. It didn't matter if they were guilty or innocent. The mere suspicion of being associated with the monarchy, or being too closely tied to royalist sympathies, was enough to seal their fate in the overcrowded cells of prisons. Like La Force and Saint-Pie, women were crammed together with little regard for their safety or comfort. The walls of their cells were damp, the air thick with disease, and the women often had nothing but straw for bedding. They were forced to live in filth with no privacy and little food. Yet it was indeed the physical discomfort that took its toll on these women. It was the mental strain of living in constant fear. The sound of the guards' footsteps outside their cell door became a constant reminder that death could come at any moment. They never knew when they would be called for the dreaded roll call, when their names would be read aloud, signaling the end of their lives. This was not just a prison, it was a psychological torment designed to break them, Grace Dalrymple Elliot. Memoirs offer a haunting account of what it was like to be imprisoned during the terror. She spoke of the stench, the fear, and the endless waiting. The terror of hearing a name called out during the roll call, knowing that it could be their own name next. She wrote about the isolation she felt being separated from her family, her allies, her friends. While male prisoners often found solidarity with one another, many of the women in prison were kept isolated, not allowed the comfort of shared companionship or camaraderie. Their isolation became their punishment, psychological torture that would break many of them long before they ever reached the guillotine. They were deprived of human connection and left to face their fate alone in the darkness of their cells. It was a fate that many of them would meet with no dignity, no ceremony, but only the brutality of the revolution's demands. Though physical torture had been officially abolished in France by 1788, the revolutionary authorities quickly found other means of extracting submission from those accused of crimes against the revolution. Interrogations were not about visible brutality, but about psychological pressure. Coercion became the tool of choice, and the threat of execution loomed over every prisoner. Women accused of treason were subjected to harsh questioning in the Revolutionary Tribunal, where judges and prosecutors were quick to pounce on any contradiction. The courts were a place of mockery where the accused were treated as guilty before ever setting foot inside the courtroom. The public had already branded them traitors, and the tribunal acted as little more than a formality designed to confirm what the public already believed. Confessions in these courts were rarely born out of truth, but from fear and exhaustion. The revolutionary authorities knew how to break a person without laying a hand on them. They used the threat of execution to coerce confessions from the accused. Women were often promised leniency only to have those promises quickly shattered as the tribunal handed down death sentences with chilling regularity outside the courtrooms. The public, this opinion was already shaped by revolutionary newspapers and posters. Newspapers like El Amidu Pupil helped shape public opinion and vilified women. Before their trials even began, the media portrayed them as enemies of the revolution, traitors who needed to be dealt with swiftly and severely. Once branded as counter-revolutionaries, these women faced a court of public judgment that had already condemned them long before they were ever given a chance to defend themselves. Their trial was a formality. The result had already been decided the moment they were arrested. The September Massacres of 1792 marked a terrifying shift in the revolution. As approach to justice, what began as a response to rumors of counter-revolutionary plots spiraled into a brutal bloodbath. The prisons of Paris became killing grounds, and women who were once members of the aristocracy were slaughtered without trial. Inmates of La Force and self-prisons, accused of royalist sympathies or connections to the clergy, were dragged from their cells and murdered by mobs. These were not executions, these were killings. Driven by panic and fear, women were dragged through the streets not by the authorities, but by citizens acting on their own belief that the revolution needed to be defended by any means necessary. The September Massacres marked the point where the revolution's thirst for blood became uncontrollable. Even prominent revolutionaries like Georges Danton justified the slaughter of prisoners, saying, "Let us be terrible, so the people will not have to be." This was the moment when the revolution's moral compass completely broke down, when it ceased to be about justice and became about vengeance. In the aftermath of the September Massacres, many of the women killed were forgotten, their names erased by the chaos of mob violence. But there were some who became symbols of the revolution's dark side. The Carmelite nuns, for example, were executed in 1794, their deaths marking the revolution's war on religion. Their hymns as they walked to the guillotine were a final act of defiance. Against the cruelty of the revolution, these women would become martyrs of faith during the revolution's bloodiest period. But for the victims of the September Massacres, their names would fade into history, stories erased by the violence of the mob.